Bertrand Russell, the mathematician, the philosopher, and the skeptic. His life and work. Introduction. Bertrand Arthur William Russell, 1872–1970, was a philosopher, mathematician, logician, essayist, and social critic whose life spanned nearly a century and whose intellectual energies covered an extraordinary range of subjects. Over the course of his 97 years, Russell was not only pivotal in developing the foundations of modern logic and analytic philosophy, but he also shaped broader cultural, political, and social thought. He authored more than 60 books and over 2,000 articles, receiving the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1950 for his varied and significant writings in which he champions humanitarian ideals and freedom of thought. A man of paradoxes, Russell was both a patrician lord. He eventually inherited the title of the third Earl Russell, and a relentless champion of radical causes. He spent time in prison as a pacifist during the First World War, was barred from certain teaching posts, and courted controversy for his vocal criticisms of religion, morality, and the established social order. Simultaneously, he was recognized in his later years as one of the most revered intellectuals of the 20th century, widely consulted on issues as wide-ranging as nuclear disarmament, international politics, and educational reform. Russell's life was thus a testament to passionate scholarship, bold activism, and a willingness to face censure for his convictions. This biography tells the story of Bertrand Russell's long life, his origins in a politically eminent British family, his pursuit of mathematical and philosophical precision, his active engagement in the public sphere, and the multiple personal upheavals that accompanied his professional achievements. His legacy persists not only in formal logic and the philosophy of mathematics, but also in the domain of social justice movements, exemplifying how a public intellectual can shape the trajectory of global thinking. To understand Bertrand Russell is to grapple with the evolution of modern thought itself, its rigorous demands for clarity, its moral convictions, and its radical striving for a freer, more rational world. Bertrand Arthur William Russell was born on May 18, 1872, in Trellick, Monmouthshire, Wales, into a family that stood at the forefront of British aristocratic politics. His paternal grandfather, John Russell, 1792–1878, was a prominent Whig statesman who served as Prime Minister under Queen Victoria. In 1861, John Russell was elevated to the peerage as the first Earl Russell. This familial connection to liberal politics, social reform, and the heart of governmental affairs would profoundly influence Bertrand's worldview, even if he would later depart from many of the Victorian mores that shaped his upbringing. Russell's father, John Russell, Viscount Amberley, and mother, Catherine Louisa Stanley, were themselves unconventional for the time. Inclined toward free-thinking and religious skepticism, they espoused liberal stances on education and sexual morality. Viscount Amberley was known to be an admirer of the utilitarian philosopher John Stuart Mill, from whom he named Mill as Bertrand's secular godfather, though Mill died shortly after Russell's birth and never played an active role in the boy's life. Catherine, for her part, came from a distinguished family of English reformers and was the daughter of Edward Stanley, the second Baron Stanley of Alderley. Despite these influences, tragedy struck Russell's childhood at a tender age. In 1874, when Bertrand was only about 2 years old, his mother died of diphtheria. His sister Rachel had passed away a few days earlier from the same illness. Less than 2 years later, in 1876, his father died of bronchitis. The orphans, Russell and his older brother Frank, were left in the care of their grandparents. Lady Russell, Bertrand's grandmother, was a deeply religious woman with rigid convictions. After the death of her husband, the first Earl Russell, she exerted a strong moral and spiritual influence on the children. She believed in a strict form of Victorian ethical discipline and raised Bertrand with an emphasis on moral righteousness, duty, and devotion to Scripture. Russell wrote in his autobiography that his grandmother's stern but loving presence was a dominating force in his early life, inspiring in him a certain moral seriousness, even as he felt stifled by the overt religiosity that he would later reject. Russell's early experiences were marked by an almost crippling loneliness. The family lived on a large estate in Pembroke Lodge, in Richmond Park near London. The isolation of life there, combined with his introspective nature, prompted the young Russell to seek solace in books and solitary reflection. He took early interest in geometry, a subject that would lay the foundation for his lifelong dedication to mathematical logic. However, Russell's childhood was not purely austere. His intellect was quickly recognized and fostered by private tutors who introduced him to the works of Euclid. Studying geometry in his early teens, Russell experienced a sense of beauty and certainty that he would later consider analogous to the intellectual satisfaction derived from pure mathematics. In his autobiography, he vividly recalled the exhilarating feeling of the initial steps in a geometrical proof, regarding it as a stepping stone into a realm of absolute clarity, free from the constraints of religious dogma and moral prohibition. This tension between the dogmatic religious environment at home and his own emerging rationalism profoundly shaped Russell's outlook. The seeds of skepticism, which he inherited from his father's side of the family, began to flourish within him. As he approached adolescence, he quietly tested the boundaries of the religious constraints imposed by his grandmother, investigating topics such as Darwin's theory of evolution and reading philosophical texts that questioned the foundations of Christian orthodoxy. Yet he did so largely in private, mindful that outward rebellion would incur his grandmother's disapproval and possibly jeopardize his carefully guarded autonomy. By the age of 18, Russell had lost nearly all of the closest members of his family. His parents, his sister, and his grandfather were all gone, and he felt an acute sense of loneliness. But the intellectual stimulation he found in mathematics and philosophy offered him a refuge. This sense of isolation, coupled with a deep intellectual curiosity, set the stage for his entrance into Cambridge University, a place that would shape his philosophical career and bring him into contact with the leading minds of his time. The environment of Cambridge, with its intellectual ferment, was a dramatic contrast to the constrained environment of his grandmother's household. There, Russell would begin to develop the systematic philosophical views that would make him one of the 20th century's most influential thinkers. In October 1890, at the age of 18, Bertrand Russell commenced his studies at Trinity College, Cambridge, one of the university's most prestigious colleges. He initially enrolled in the mathematical tripos, reflecting his abiding fascination with geometry and numbers. This phase of Russell's life was transformative. It moved him from the intellectual seclusion of his childhood into an environment thriving with debate, research, and scholarly rivalry. Cambridge offered him a network of friends, mentors, and intellectual interlocutors who would guide and challenge his developing worldview. One of the formative experiences of Russell's early Cambridge years was his encounter with Alfred North Whitehead, 1861–1947. Whitehead was a mathematician and philosopher at Trinity who became not only a mentor to Russell, but also his eventual co-author on their groundbreaking work, Principia Mathematica. Whitehead's scholarship in algebraic logic and foundational mathematics expanded the intellectual possibilities Russell had previously glimpsed in his solitary studies of geometry. Russell soon found himself caught up in the fervor of discovering the deeper logical structures underlying mathematics, convinced that mathematics, and by extension philosophy, required a more secure, logical foundation. Simultaneously, Russell was grappling with philosophical questions that extended far beyond the confines of mathematics. He was drawn to the writings of German philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, 1646–1716, whose monadology and symbolic logic intrigued him. Russell studied Leibniz in such depth that, in 1900, he would publish a critical exposition of the philosophy of Leibniz, demonstrating a remarkable command of both Leibniz's metaphysical system and the potential of symbolic logic to clarify philosophical discourse. This early publication foreshadowed Russell's method, a rigorous analytic approach that sought to untangle complex philosophical ideas by employing the precision of symbolic notation and clear argumentation. Cambridge also exposed Russell to the broader tradition of British empiricism, from John Locke to George Berkeley to David Hume. While the influence of continental rationalists like Descartes and Leibniz remained strong, it was the empirical approach, stressing the role of sensory experience in the formation of ideas, that resonated with Russell's desire to ground philosophical arguments in a clear and testable framework. This grounding was no mere intellectual exercise for him. He was determined to overcome the monastic scholasticism, as he called it, that often characterized late 19th century academic philosophy. Philosophy steeped in theological or metaphysical presuppositions without sufficient attention to rigorous analysis. During these years, Russell's intellectual engagement spilled beyond strictly mathematical or philosophical circles. He was briefly enthralled by socialism, drawing on ideas from the Fabian Society, which included thinkers like George Bernard Shaw and Sidney Webb, although Russell would not always remain closely identified with socialist politics in the strict sense. These early political explorations signaled a broader trend in Russell's life, an ongoing search for ways to merge his philosophical commitments with social and political activism. Russell graduated with a BA in mathematics in 1893, achieving remarkable distinctions. This marked the end of his formal undergraduate training, but hardly the end of his association with Cambridge. He became a Fellow of Trinity College in 1895, a position that would anchor him in an academic environment conducive to extended research, debate, and authorship. In the mid-1890s, he also spent time in Berlin studying economics, further reflecting his diverse scholarly interests, though it was logic, epistemology, and the foundations of mathematics that remained at the core of his pursuits. Throughout the late 1890s, Russell's intellectual horizons continued to expand. He delved into the writings of Immanuel Kant and the emerging wave of logic scholars such as Giuseppe Peano. He attended the International Congress of Philosophy in Paris in 1900, where he encountered Peano's logical notation. This would prove decisive for Russell's subsequent development of logical theories. Peano's notation offered a way to express mathematical statements with unprecedented clarity and to explore the relationship between formal languages and natural languages. In short, Russell's years at Cambridge solidified the interlocking themes of his intellectual career: a fascination with the logical structure of mathematics and language, a commitment to an empiricist epistemology, and a growing interest in employing philosophy to address social and political questions. This early period laid the groundwork for his major achievements in the philosophy of mathematics and logic, which would soon unfold in his co-authored magnum opus, Principia Mathematica. By the turn of the 20th century, the quest for a solid logical foundation of mathematics had become something of a holy grail for mathematicians and philosophers alike. Russell was at the forefront of this endeavor. Spurred by his encounters with Gottlob Frege's logic and Giuseppe Peano's formal notation, Russell believed that the truths of mathematics might be reduced, or at least shown to be grounded, in logical principles. If successful, such a project would unify mathematics and logic in a rigorous framework, thereby answering the skepticism about mathematics' certainty that had been raised by earlier philosophers like Hume. Between 1900 and 1903, Russell worked intensively on problems in the foundations of mathematics. In 1903, he published The Principles of Mathematics, a substantial treatise outlining the philosophical underpinnings for his logicist thesis, that mathematics is, at bottom, an extension of pure logic. However, the book also revealed difficulties that would occupy him for the next decade. One such difficulty was Russell's paradox, the paradox he discovered in Gottlob Frege's logical system, which arises when considering the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. If such a set existed, it both would and would not contain itself, thus creating a logical contradiction. Frege, who was in the final stages of publishing his magnum opus Basic Laws of Arithmetic, was deeply distressed by Russell's discovery, but Russell was undeterred. Rather than abandon the logicist program, he sought a modification of Frege's system that would eliminate the paradox. He turned to his old mentor, Alfred North Whitehead, for collaboration. By 1908, Russell and Whitehead began the mammoth task of writing Principia Mathematica. Published in 3 volumes between 1910 and 1913, Principia Mathematica is often seen as one of the greatest intellectual achievements of the 20th century. In Principia Mathematica, Russell and Whitehead laid out a formal system intended to derive all of mathematics from logical axioms and rules of inference. They carefully introduced a theory of types to circumvent self-referential paradoxes like Russell's paradox. The idea was that expressions in the system were assigned types to prevent sets from containing themselves or other similarly paradoxical constructions. In principle, by climbing through a hierarchy of types, the system avoided the circular definitions that led to contradiction. The sheer density and rigor of Principia Mathematica is staggering. Famously, in the first volume, it took over 300 pages before Russell and Whitehead could prove that 1 + 1 = 2, illustrating the level of meticulousness that they believed was necessary to show mathematics' foundation in logic. Despite its formidable complexity, the work drew acclaim from mathematicians, philosophers, and logicians. It validated the seriousness of the logicist perspective, even if subsequent developments, especially Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorems in 1931, showed that the project of establishing a complete and consistent logical foundation for all of mathematics might be unattainable in the form Russell had envisioned. Nonetheless, the importance of Principia Mathematica cannot be overstated. It spurred the growth of mathematical logic as a specialized discipline, influencing later luminaries like Ludwig Wittgenstein, Rudolf Carnap, Alonzo Church, and Alan Turing. It laid the conceptual groundwork for later developments in computer science, metamathematics, and the philosophy of language. Indeed, Russell's own student, Ludwig Wittgenstein, would revolutionize philosophy in the 20th century, partly in response to the premises laid out in Principia Mathematica and Russell's earlier writings. During the Principia years, Russell was also undertaking significant philosophical writing outside the purely formal domain. He authored Philosophical Essays, 1910, and The Problems of Philosophy, 1912, the latter of which remains one of the most accessible introductions to his brand of analytic philosophy. In these works, Russell tried to bridge the rigor of logical analysis with more traditional philosophical concerns like the nature of knowledge, the distinction between appearance and reality, and the role of induction in science. He criticized idealism, the then dominant trend in British philosophy, insisting that the objects of our knowledge are not ideas in our minds, but external entities about which we can have direct or indirect acquaintance. By the time Principia Mathematica was completed, Russell was firmly ensconced as a leading figure in analytic philosophy. Yet life events were about to disrupt his academic pursuits, drawing him into the swirl of global conflict and domestic controversies. The next phase of his life would test the limits of his convictions about pacifism, free speech, and civil disobedience, transforming him from a respected Cambridge don into a public intellectual of international renown and sometimes notoriety. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 shattered the relative tranquility of Russell's scholarly world. As countries across Europe mobilized, Russell's conscience led him to oppose the war. While many intellectuals and politicians on both sides found reasons to support their nation's war efforts, Russell stood resolutely on pacifist grounds, criticizing the conflict as a catastrophic failure of international diplomacy and reason. His anti-war stance grew partly out of a philosophical commitment to rational discourse, and partly out of a humanitarian conviction that war was an avoidable tragedy afflicting millions of innocent people. Russell's outspoken pacifism quickly drew official censure. In 1916, he was fined and dismissed from his post at Trinity College for publicly criticizing the Allies' conduct of the war. He was barred from traveling to the United States, where he had intended to lecture. The British government, alarmed by any signs of domestic dissent that might undermine the war effort, viewed Russell as a dangerous subversive voice. He continued to write anti-war essays and speak at pacifist gatherings, championing the notion that disputes between nations should be settled through negotiation and rational discourse rather than violence. In 1917, Russell faced a more severe legal repercussion. He was convicted under the Defense of the Realm Act for publishing an article suggesting that American troops might be used to quell domestic opposition to the war in Britain. As a result, he served 6 months in Brixton Prison in 1918. Far from discouraging him, prison provided a platform for introspection and further writing. He used his time there to write Introduction to Mathematical Philosophy, 1919, a more accessible treatment of themes he had developed with Whitehead in Principia Mathematica. Russell later reflected that prison offered him a pleasant time for study and writing, free from the usual interruptions, though he lamented the physical discomfort and the psychological toll of confinement. Russell's staunch pacifism and willingness to face imprisonment for his beliefs elevated his public profile considerably. His moral stance appealed to a segment of the public disillusioned by the war's staggering casualties, while others denounced him as a traitor, a dangerous radical, or at best, an impractical idealist. After his release, Russell continued to agitate for peace, writing critical assessments of the peace treaties that ended the war. In works like Justice in Wartime, 1917, and later publications, he questioned not only the justifications for war, but also the righteousness of the victorious Allies' aims. He lamented what he saw as vindictive punishment meted out to Germany in the Treaty of Versailles, predicting that such terms would sow the seeds of future conflict. His predictions, of course, were borne out by the events that led to World War II. Russell's involvement in pacifist and progressive causes was more than an isolated episode. It was emblematic of a broader ethical and political philosophy that sought to apply the rigors of rational analysis to global social problems. He believed that if humankind could approach its disputes logically, setting aside religious dogma, nationalistic fervor, and tribal prejudices, it might attain a peaceful and cooperative international community. This conviction undergirded much of his activism throughout his life, though his positions on warfare evolved in response to changing historical circumstances, particularly the rise of totalitarian regimes in the 1930s and the onset of the nuclear age. World War I thus stands as a pivotal juncture in Russell's life. While he remained deeply invested in logic and philosophy, he also began to embrace the role of a public intellectual confronting urgent moral and political questions of his time. This dual engagement, straddling the academic realm of mathematics and philosophy on one hand, and the incendiary realm of public activism on the other, would mark the remainder of his career. With the war over and the political landscape of Europe undergoing dramatic change, Russell entered the interwar period determined to fuse his academic interests with his public moral commitments. Although still recognized primarily as a philosopher and logician, he found his voice expanding into new realms including education, social criticism, and a broad critique of traditional morality. It was during these years that Russell wrote some of his best-known popular works, establishing himself as one of the era's most visible and provocative public intellectuals. One of the key texts that exemplified Russell's shift toward a more accessible philosophical writing was The Problems of Philosophy, 1912, which he had largely composed just before World War I. The book sought to introduce readers to the central issues in epistemology and metaphysics, such as the nature of knowledge, perception, and reality, using a clarity of style that departed from the stifling academic prose of the time. Although it predates the interwar years by a short margin, its success and wide readership laid the foundation for his subsequent forays into accessible writing. Russell soon followed with Our Knowledge of the External World, 1914, a compilation of lectures he delivered at the Lowell Institute in Boston. This work laid out Russell's fledgling doctrine of logical atomism, a philosophical view holding that the world consists of a set of discrete facts or atoms, and that understanding these facts requires careful logical analysis of language. By dissecting propositions into their simplest components, Russell believed we could better understand the structure of reality. Logical atomism promised a fresh start in philosophy, one free from the metaphysical entanglements of Hegelian idealism that had dominated British universities in the late 19th century. Throughout the 1920s, Russell emerged as a trenchant critic of religion and conventional morality. In essays such as Why I'm Not a Christian, a speech delivered in 1927, later published in essay form, he mounted a direct assault on theistic beliefs, arguing that religious doctrines were unsupported by rational evidence and had historically contributed to societal repression. His critique stirred considerable controversy, particularly in Britain and the United States, where mainstream religious sentiment remained strong. Russell contended that moral progress depended on liberating human thought from dogmatic strictures, championing instead a secular morality grounded in reason, empathy, and scientific understanding. Simultaneously, Russell devoted significant energy to educational reform. Disturbed by what he saw as the authoritarian and unimaginative nature of traditional schooling, he and his second wife, Dora Black, founded the experimental Beacon Hill School in 1927. The school's philosophy emphasized freedom, creativity, and self-expression, reflecting Russell's broader convictions about nurturing independent thought rather than rote learning or moral indoctrination. Though Beacon Hill School would ultimately prove financially unsustainable, it served as a living testament to Russell's educational ideals and foreshadowed later progressive approaches to pedagogy. During the interwar years, Russell also traveled widely and wrote commentaries on political systems he encountered. In 1920, he visited the Soviet Union and met Vladimir Lenin. Initially sympathetic to the ideals of the Russian Revolution, Russell quickly became critical of the authoritarian direction taken by the Bolsheviks. He documented his observations in The Practice and Theory of Bolshevism, 1920, expressing admiration for the revolution's aims but grave reservations about the methods of one-party rule. This measured critique placed him in a curious position, neither fully allied with Western capitalism nor with Soviet communism. In the realm of analytic philosophy, Russell continued refining his ideas in works like The Analysis of Mind, 1921, where he explored the nature of consciousness, perception, and belief, integrating insights from psychology and physics. He sought a naturalistic understanding of the mind that accounted for both subjective experience and the objective reality in which minds operate. This approach was a precursor to later philosophical movements that emphasized the philosophy of mind, cognitive science, and linguistic analysis. All the while, Russell was riding a wave of controversy fueled by his outspoken views. Several academic positions in the United States were denied to him in the late 1910s and early 1920s due to his radical politics and frank writings on sexuality. Notably, in 1918, the City College of New York rescinded Russell's professorship after a legal challenge, arguing that his opinions, particularly his critiques of conventional marriage, made him unfit to teach American youth. Yet Russell's commitment to free thought and social reform was undaunted. He believed that subjecting core beliefs, religious, political, sexual, to the scrutiny of logic and reason was essential for human progress. The interwar period thus saw Russell transform from a somewhat bookish Cambridge don into a full-fledged public intellectual and social critic, sparking debate and reverence in equal measure. While Bertrand Russell's intellectual achievements garnered him acclaim, his personal life was equally noteworthy and often controversial. Over the course of his long life, Russell married 4 times, challenging Victorian norms of marriage and sexuality and sparking scandal in the press. His relationships often intertwined with his philosophical convictions about love, freedom, and personal happiness. Russell's first marriage to Alice Pearsall Smith began in 1894. Alice was an American Quaker, and the marriage initially represented a youthful romance. However, Russell's intense work ethic and evolving philosophical pursuits soon clashed with Alice's expectations. By 1902, Russell famously realized on a solitary bicycle ride that he no longer loved her. He tried for several years to sustain the relationship, but the marriage effectively collapsed long before the legal divorce in 1921. This was a tumultuous time. Russell's growing renown was overshadowed by whisperings about the moral propriety of his personal life, especially given the rigid moral codes of Edwardian England. Shortly after his divorce from Alice, Russell married his second wife, Dora Black, in 1921. Dora was a writer, feminist, and socialist who shared many of Russell's political and educational convictions. Together, they established Beacon Hill School, reflecting their shared commitment to progressive education. During the 1920s, the couple's home became a salon of sorts, attracting artists, writers, and political activists. Dora and Bertrand had 2 children, John and Catherine, and for a time, their intellectual and emotional partnership seemed to flourish. Yet tension surfaced as both Bertrand and Dora engaged in extramarital affairs, consistent with their shared belief in the freedom of sexual and emotional expression. These arrangements, however, proved more turbulent in practice than in theory. Eventually, the couple separated in the early 1930s, finalizing their divorce in 1935. Dora's increasing radicalism, coupled with disagreements over finances, the children's upbringing, and the day-to-day realities of open marriage brought the partnership to a fractious end. Russell's third marriage to Patricia, Peter Spence, was more conventional by his own admission. Patricia had been a governess to Russell's children. They married in 1936, and this union brought Russell a measure of domestic tranquility after the stormy years with Dora. Patricia and Russell had one son, Conrad, born in 1937. Yet the relationship soured over time, partly due to Russell's demanding public schedule, various personal differences, and the repeated financial pressures that dogged the Russell family. They divorced in 1949, and Russell soon married his fourth and final wife, Edith Finch, in 1952. Edith, an American author and editor, would remain with Russell until his death in 1970, providing him a steady emotional anchor and collaborating on a range of literary projects. Throughout his marriages, Russell's ideas about love, sex, and morality evolved. His 1929 book Marriage and Morals argued that conventional sexual ethics were rooted in outdated religious doctrines, and that society would benefit from a more liberal attitude towards sex and relationships. The book sparked outrage. In the United States, it was cited as a reason for the legal ruling that effectively barred Russell from teaching at the City College of New York. Nevertheless, the work influenced later generations of liberals and feminists, who found in Russell an early advocate for sexual freedom and women's rights. Scandal often accompanied Russell's personal life, and the press gleefully reported on his divorces, affairs, and outspoken views on sexuality. Russell neither shied away from these controversies nor allowed them to silence him. If anything, they seem to confirm his conviction that societal norms often rest on unexamined prejudices. Over time, the disapproval of conservative society did little to dent Russell's reputation as a formidable philosopher and mathematician. To many, his personal life appeared as a laboratory in which he tested the convictions he championed in his writings, convictions about the importance of personal freedom, the possibility of enduring love without rigid constraints, and the necessity of living a life guided by one's reason rather than unthinking conformity. Whether one deemed these experiments successful or otherwise, they undeniably contributed to the public fascination with Bertrand Russell, a figure who blended the roles of philosopher, radical critic, and unapologetic nonconformist. The period surrounding World War II witnessed both a deepening of Russell's public profile and the culmination of one of his most ambitious scholarly projects. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, Russell had already become a household name in many intellectual circles, noted for his prolific writings on philosophy, politics, and social issues. Yet it was his single volume, A History of Western Philosophy, published in 1945, that brought him a level of global renown unmatched by his earlier, more technical works. Written primarily during World War II, A History of Western Philosophy was a sweeping account of Western thought from the pre-Socratics to the early 20th century. Unlike some historians of ideas who strove for absolute neutrality, Russell injected his own philosophical judgments throughout the text. He praised thinkers like Locke and Hume for their contributions to empiricism, criticized Aquinas and other medieval scholastics for what he saw as undue reliance on theology, and took measured views of Kant and Nietzsche. With his characteristic wit and clarity, Russell sought to present philosophy as a grand conversation, occasionally derailed by dogma but always returning to a pursuit of rational understanding. The book became an immediate commercial success, especially in the United States, where it topped bestseller lists. Its success was partly due to the accessible, almost conversational style in which Russell recounted complex philosophical arguments. It also tapped into a broader cultural interest in fundamental questions about human nature and society, at a time when the world was grappling with the devastation of war and the moral failings exemplified by fascist regimes. Critics faulted Russell for occasional oversimplifications or personal bias, but few denied the breadth and erudition of the work. Between the wars and following World War II, Russell became one of the great public intellectuals of his time. He was not content merely to reflect on world events, he actively engaged in debate. During the late 1930s, Russell had grown increasingly alarmed by the rise of totalitarian regimes in Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union. He moderated his strict pacifism in light of Adolf Hitler's aggression, believing that fascist tyranny had to be confronted, even if it meant military conflict. This shift was a source of controversy among some of his pacifist friends, but Russell argued that Hitler posed an existential threat to liberal democracy. In addition to political discourse, Russell also turned his eye to science, particularly the philosophical implications of developments in physics. In books like The ABC of Relativity, 1925, and The Analysis of Matter, 1927, he grappled with the theories of Albert Einstein and the new quantum mechanics. While Russell's main contributions remained philosophical, his willingness to engage with cutting-edge scientific discoveries displayed his conviction that a philosopher must be conversant with empirical findings if philosophical speculation was to remain credible. By the time A History of Western Philosophy was published, Russell had relocated to the United States for several years. He held various teaching appointments, including at the University of California, Los Angeles, and briefly at the Barnes Foundation in Pennsylvania. His American lecture tours drew large crowds, reflecting a widespread hunger for intellectual stimulation during a tumultuous era. However, as noted, he was often dogged by controversy, most notably the legal challenges in New York over his suitability to teach. Nevertheless, these controversies did little to dent the popularity of A History of Western Philosophy. The book's royalties provided Russell with financial security for the remainder of his life, enabling him to pursue his writing and activism without constant worry about funding. It also cemented his reputation as a philosopher who could skillfully bridge the gap between specialist and popular audiences, teaching the history of ideas to a global readership that had perhaps never before engaged so thoroughly with the arc of Western thought. In essence, A History of Western Philosophy stands as a testament to Russell's lifelong endeavor to demystify complex ideas, champion rational inquiry, and connect philosophical discourse to the pressing issues of his day. For millions of readers in the post-war era, it became their first serious encounter with the Western philosophical tradition, opening doors to minds that might otherwise have found the subject intimidating or irrelevant. Though World War I had sparked Russell's initial foray into pacifist activism, it was the aftermath of World War II and the dawning nuclear age that galvanized his reputation as a global campaigner for peace. Horrified by the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, Russell became one of the earliest and most vocal critics of nuclear weapons, warning that humanity's survival depended on preventing nuclear warfare. Russell's concerns about nuclear weapons intersected with his broader philosophical outlook. Having dedicated his life to rational argumentation, he found it deeply troubling that national rivalries and ideological conflicts could spiral into a nuclear apocalypse. In Human Knowledge, Its Scope and Limits, 1948, he explored how human reason, when guided by scientific understanding and free inquiry, might navigate existential challenges. But the book also carried an undercurrent of anxiety about humanity's capacity for irrational and destructive behavior. By the late 1940s and into the 1950s, Russell was an increasingly visible figure in the peace movement. In 1954, after the United States tested a hydrogen bomb at Bikini Atoll, Russell authored the Einstein-Russell Manifesto, published in 1955. Co-signed by Albert Einstein shortly before his death and other leading scientists, the manifesto called for the abandonment of nuclear weapons and urged governments to find peaceful solutions to international disputes. This document served as the impetus for the first Pugwash Conference on Science and World Affairs in 1957, which gathered scientists and intellectuals from around the world to discuss strategies for reducing the nuclear threat. Russell's advocacy was not limited to petitions and conferences. In 1958, he became the founding president of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND, in Britain, lending his moral authority and rhetorical skill to a movement that attracted both widespread support and political resistance. Undeterred by his advanced age, Russell participated in marches, rallies, and even direct actions. His willingness to engage in civil disobedience led to arrests on multiple occasions, most famously in 1961, when he was 89 years old and spent a week in jail following a protest against nuclear weapons at the Ministry of Defence in London. Yet the nuclear issue was only one of the global concerns that preoccupied Russell in his later years. He was a fierce critic of the Vietnam War and Western imperialism more broadly, establishing the International War Crimes Tribunal, often referred to as the Russell Tribunal, in 1966, along with French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. This tribunal aimed to investigate alleged war crimes committed by the United States in Vietnam, functioning as an unofficial but symbolically potent body of moral judgment. Although lacking legal authority, the Russell Tribunal drew international attention to the ethical implications of the war. On the philosophical side, Russell continued to publish on a variety of topics, including ethics, political theory, and the philosophy of language. His 1940s and 1950s works, such as An Inquiry into Meaning and Truth, 1940, and Human Knowledge, Its Scope and Limits, 1948, further examined how humans acquire knowledge and the extent to which scientific methods could resolve epistemological disputes. While Russell's later philosophical works were perhaps less groundbreaking than his earlier contributions to logic, they underscored his unwavering commitment to rational inquiry and empirical scrutiny. In parallel, Russell became a public commentator on world affairs, often writing op-eds and letters to newspapers, offering critiques of government policies and calling for disarmament. His ability to remain relevant and influential in the public sphere, even as he advanced into his 80s and 90s, testifies to the power of his convictions and the respect he commanded on the international stage. Bertrand Russell's extraordinary life culminated in a series of accolades and continued activism well into his 9th decade. In 1950, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, a recognition that many found surprising for a philosopher more known for his contributions to logic and moral philosophy than for conventional literary endeavors. The Nobel Committee justified their decision by citing Russell's extensive body of writing, championing humanitarian ideals and freedom of thought, indicating that the concept of literature they were honoring encompassed the broad realm of letters and intellectual influence. Russell used the platform of the Nobel Prize to further articulate his vision for a world guided by reason, empathy, and tolerance. In his acceptance speech, he underscored the dangers of dogma, whether religious, political, or ideological, and the necessity of open-minded inquiry to preserve human civilization. The prize also offered a final flourish to a career that had begun in the austere settings of Victorian Britain and led him to become a moral and philosophical lodestar for a global audience. During the 1950s and 1960s, Russell's commitment to nuclear disarmament and peace activism only intensified. He wrote numerous open letters and articles, challenging the superpowers to dismantle their nuclear arsenals and condemning military interventions. Even as some of his contemporaries thought his stances unrealistic or overly utopian, Russell had by then become a living symbol of defiance against war and oppression. Younger generations, particularly in the 1960s era of counterculture and social upheaval, often looked to Russell as an inspirational figure who had consistently confronted authority, from his imprisonment during World War I to his protests against the Vietnam War. Russell's personal life settled into relative calm. His final marriage to Edith Finch in 1952 provided him the companionship and support to continue his extensive writing and campaigning activities. Edith became an essential collaborator in his later projects, helping to organize his voluminous papers and correspondence. Russell's circle of admirers and visitors included statesmen, scientists, authors, and activists, all eager to gain insight from one of the last remaining Victorians who was also in tune with the radical currents of the 20th century. As he entered his 90s, Russell showed no intention of retreating from public debate. He maintained a lively correspondence, continued giving interviews, and participated in public protests. In 1967, he made a notable radio broadcast, condemning the atrocities of the Vietnam War and calling for an immediate cessation of hostilities. Right up to the end, he remained convinced that reason, science, and compassion could guide humanity through its darkest moments, if only enough people were willing to abandon the irrational loyalties that led to conflict. Bertrand Russell died of influenza on February 2, 1970, at his home in Penrhyn-Dudreth, Wales, at the age of 97. In accordance with his wishes, there was no religious ceremony. His ashes were scattered over the Welsh mountains, a fitting end for a man who had insisted throughout his life on the primacy of empirical realities over spiritual dogmas. In a final statement, prepared shortly before his death, Russell offered a cautionary message to future generations, warning of the dire consequences of nuclear proliferation and urging the pursuit of knowledge and peace. He left behind a sprawling intellectual legacy that encompasses logic, the philosophy of mathematics, analytic philosophy, moral and political thought, and a wide range of social critiques. Beyond his formal philosophical achievements, Russell's life demonstrated how a scholar could engage vigorously with the pressing moral and political issues of his day, and do so without abandoning intellectual rigor. To this day, the imprint of Bertrand Russell can be felt in multiple domains. In logic and the foundations of mathematics, he is remembered for Principia Mathematica and the eponymous Russell's paradox. In analytic philosophy, his ideas about logical analysis and the structure of language paved the way for future giants like Ludwig Wittgenstein and the logical positivists. In public discourse, his unwavering belief in reason, free thought, and social justice stands as a beacon for those who see in the life of the mind not a retreat from the world, but a means of transforming it. Bertrand Russell's story is one of remarkable breadth, from his aristocratic birth during the reign of Queen Victoria to his role as a revered yet controversial global intellectual in the era of nuclear weapons and the space race. His contributions to the philosophy of mathematics alone would secure his place in intellectual history. Principia Mathematica, written with Alfred North Whitehead, reshaped the landscape of mathematical logic and influenced the direction of 20th century philosophy, computer science, and linguistic theory. The notion that mathematical truths might be deduced from logical axioms signaled a novel paradigm that fueled decades of subsequent research, culminating in further developments by Kurt Gödel, Alonzo Church, Alan Turing, and others. Yet Russell's impact extends far beyond the Academy's walls. As an essayist and popular writer, he reached millions through works like The Problems of Philosophy, Why I Am Not a Christian, and A History of Western Philosophy. These texts open the door to philosophical questions for ordinary readers, demystifying arcane debates and exposing the timeless questions about knowledge, ethics, and the nature of reality. His clarity of prose, marked by wry humor and a fearless willingness to challenge sacred cows, became a benchmark for public intellectual writing. Even those who disagreed with his conclusions recognized the lucidity and vigor of his arguments. On social and political matters, Russell embodied the ideal of the engaged intellectual who dares to oppose prevailing opinion. His pacifism during World War I and his campaigns against nuclear weapons and the Vietnam War revealed a willingness to sacrifice social standing and personal freedom in pursuit of ethical principles. This activism, grounded in a deep-seated rationalism, underscored his belief that errors in reasoning underlie many of humanity's worst catastrophes, from religious strife to global conflicts. To remedy these errors, Russell insisted on educating the public in the virtues of logic, skepticism, and scientific inquiry. Simultaneously, Russell was a champion for individual freedom, especially regarding marriage, sexuality, and education. His life served as a testing ground for these views, resulting in multiple marriages, public scandals, and a progressive school that challenged conventional pedagogical norms. Whether one admires or questions his personal choices, Russell's insistence that private morality and social norms be subjected to critical scrutiny remains a foundational principle for many modern liberals and humanists. His later life activism on nuclear disarmament, in concert with his philosophical outlook, helped shape the global conversation around the existential risks of modern technology. In the Pugwash conferences, the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, and countless public statements, he captured the zeitgeist of an era on the brink of self-annihilation. By positioning rational negotiation and empathy as antidotes to nuclear brinkmanship, he offered a moral vision that endures in debates over arms control, climate change, and other planetary threats. Moreover, Russell's intellectual legacy survives in the institutional realm. Many philosophy and logic departments around the world still examine Russell's works as foundational texts. Scholars continue to build upon or critique his positions, whether in philosophy of language, where Russell's theory of definite description still provokes debate, ethics, or political theory. His name frequently appears in discussions of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century, alongside Albert Einstein, Sigmund Freud, and John Maynard Keynes, as one who profoundly influenced our worldview. Bertrand Russell thus stands as a model of what it means to be both a scholar and a citizen of the world. He fused rigorous analysis with moral passion, never content to remain cloistered within academic debates. Even decades after his death, Russell's writings speak to new generations confronting fresh dilemmas about science, technology, war, and human well-being. Few intellectuals have bridged as many domains: mathematics, logic, philosophy, politics, education, and fewer still have done so with as much elan and clarity of purpose. Bertrand Russell lived through monumental transformations: the decline of the British Empire, 2 devastating world wars, the dawn of nuclear weapons, and the early stirrings of the information age. In each epoch-defining shift, he refused to be merely a spectator. Instead, he deployed the tools of philosophy and mathematics to question assumptions, propose solutions, and critique the societal norms he believed to be flawed or harmful. From the privacy of austere childhood tutelage to the fervent activism of his 80s and 90s, Russell relentlessly championed reason, freedom, and compassion. His biography is in many ways a chronicle of the 20th century's intellectual evolution. As a pioneer in logic and the foundations of mathematics, Russell shaped an entire field. As a philosophical writer, he introduced millions to the wonders and puzzles of thought, demystifying complex ideas and advocating for the supremacy of reason over superstition. As a political activist, he exposed the moral failings of warfare and tyranny, courting controversy and incarceration to make his voice heard. His personal life, replete with complex marriages, family upheavals, and progressive educational experiments, mirrored his broader refusal to accept conventions at face value. Russell's enduring popularity among students, scholars, and general readers stems from more than just the historical significance of his work. It lies in the sheer candor, humor, and clarity he brought to every topic he touched. He gave license to subsequent generations of philosophers to engage publicly with issues of social justice and global survival, bridging the seemingly disparate worlds of abstract inquiry and concrete political struggle. If the essence of philosophy is, as Socrates claimed, the pursuit of wisdom and the critical examination of life, then Russell stands as one of the tradition's most stalwart exemplars. More than 5 decades after his death, we can still heed his lessons about the dangers of dogma, the necessity of skepticism, and the profound human capacity for empathy. In a world still fraught with division, inequality, and the looming spectre of technological and environmental catastrophes, Russell's call for rational discourse and moral courage remains as resonant as ever. His life testifies that thought without action is sterile, and action without thought is blind. In striving to unite the two, Bertrand Russell forged a legacy that endures, a testament to the power of the examined life in service of a more enlightened and humane society.